Hello, thank you for joining us for our third webinar for Compost Awareness Week in 2026. My name is Dr. Matt Bertucci. I'm a professor in horticulture at the University of Arkansas System Division of Agriculture. And today you're going to be hearing about using compost as a soil amendment. That's a presentation I'll be giving. And then you'll also hear from my PhD student, Rachel Woody-Pumford, about how to do a bioassay to detect any sort of problems, especially some of the persistent herbicides that might be present in a compost that you've purchased or procured from someplace. So these are really good applied activities and understandings of compost. So we hope that you enjoy it, and please let us know if you have any other questions. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us for our third webinar for Compost Awareness Week in 2026. So you've already heard from Fabian Shields and Colin Massey. We've heard from some of the people for composting on campus from the Student Union and the Fayetteville School District. And initially I called this, Compost 101 was on Monday, and I called this Compost 201. So the idea is that it gets a little bit more advanced. And the real reason is we talked about it in some of our other webinars, but everybody looks at compost differently. And we're going to look at this as how do we use the compost in our soils? What can we hope to achieve when we use compost as a soil amendment? What are the things that it does for the soils? And Rachel, my PhD student, is going to talk about some of the common, well, not some of the common pitfalls, but a certain type of pitfall that you might want to avoid and how you can make sure your compost is safe for use on your soils before you put it out there. So here on the left, you can see permanent beds that we built using a BCS walk-behind tractor. And that's decent quality soil. It's got some color to it, and it's certainly got a lot of tilth because we just stirred it up. But on the right is a permanent bed that's been, built up and then top dressed with a much darker compost, right? That black gold. And so we're going to be talking about what are some of the things that that compost can do for us, and what are some of the ways that we can effectively use it on our farms and in our gardens. And as a reminder, if you have any questions, type them into the Q&A during the presentations. We will see them. I have it popped up right in front of me. So I'm going to start with my interest in compost. How did I get here? Why am I looking at it? And personally, I've been composting in my backyard for like 7 years, 6 years, something like that. Basically, my wife asked me she said she'd like a compost pile, and I do most of the yard stuff. So I said, sure. And we figured it out. So I've had this compost pile. This is, the more mature version of it. This was what it looked like when I first started. I just got some, chicken wire or whatever you want to call that, the fencing, the wire fencing, and some T-posts, and just kind of heaped it up and filled it when it filled, stirred it around when it stirred around. You could tell I clearly didn't put a tarp to keep the moisture out because that really was holding a lot of moisture there. But over time, I learned and invested more in it. So at some point, I got a little kit. I did not fabricate that myself, but I got some, tongue and groove wood frame where I kind of drove those boards into the ground and then slotted the boards in with some spacers. So I now have a two-bay system, and it's been a lot of fun. I know we've talked a lot about this. There's a lot of educational opportunity. There's environmental science you could learn about. There's waste stream stuff that you can learn about. There's horticulture you can learn about. There's biology that you can learn about. So there's just a lot of fun things that are happening in addition to just the strictly making a fertilizer or making a soil amendment, right? There's a lot of things that you can observe over the course of the creation process. So here on the left, I had a pumpkin seed that germinated that must have been like 11 inches deep. I happened to hit a shovel right alongside this supremely elongated hypocotyl. So that's the region beneath the cotyledons. And this was also probably in February. So typically cucurbits want soils to be mid to high 80s before germination occurs. So that's telling me that, in February in Fayetteville, we're not getting anywhere near the 80s. But inside my compost pile, I wasn't getting super hot, but I was getting hot enough to stimulate germination to see these pumpkins start to grow. Of course, as my compost pile cooled, I had fun little invertebrates like these worms encroaching into my pile. I also had vertebrate visitors. So for a long time, I thought my dog was eating my compost and it was getting me upset because I was worried he was going to get sick or choke on something. But it turned out we just had groundhog visitors coming in and out, which I don't mind too much, but I don't like the idea of him defecating on the pile, just that, because I want to make sure that that soil amendment doesn't have something that I didn't intend to have in it. And then this is a fun thing. If you're somebody who still has some turf in your landscaping, oftentimes we tell people, and the extension service, we encourage people to return their leaf clippings to the lawn. That's actually a good thing to do when you've got green grass. The leaf blades will generally just kind of reincorporate, break down, and they'll add some nitrogen credits to your soils without causing any big problems. But early in the spring, if you're like me, I let my lawn in the fall get really, really shaggy. Like I have really tall Bermuda grass that even starts to flop over. Uh, but then come spring, you need to remove all of that vegetation. And so what ends up happening is I come in, I scalp off my lawn, I cut all that dead Bermuda grass leaf tissue and stem tissue off, and I've saved those bags, and that actually makes a really, really good brown matter for your compost piles. So you don't want to return those grass clippings to the lawn because it will just shade out your new Bermuda grass. But all the other clippings, when you're in an active growing season, those should be returned to the lawn. So I wanted to take a minute, and if y'all want to put into the Q&A, you're welcome to. But I think this is a good thing to think about because we talk about compost a lot, and I've mentioned the different stakeholder groups. So what do you think of when you hear the word compost? What comes to your mind's eye? And it's important to think about because the material comes from a lot of different sources. It might be something that you're making in your home lawn. You might have, your kids playing in these leaves that then you shred up and you add to the compost pile, and you're adding food throughout the week. Or it might be something way more sophisticated like we see in the top left. This is actually the city of Bentonville's wastewater treatment facility. They have a series of 6 in-vessel composters. I forget the length. I think they're like 60 feet long, but those are, large drums. They're taking all of the, sewage material, they're processing it, drying it down, incorporating that with different wood chips, and then they're composting it in a vessel. So there's all sorts of air circulation and agitation and airflow and moisture control such that they get really fast, really active composting occurring in those vessels to the point that they get, the full composting criteria completed. I want to say it's in 14 days. Is that right, Rachel? Yeah, it was 14 days. Now, they don't just take that and turn it over to the public. They then will use that material and build windrows like we see in the bottom right. Those are actually windrows from Fort Smith, but they make these windrows and they actually age the compost further before they turn it over to the public. But they can achieve their composting really, really rapidly with those vessels. And the vessels also have the added benefit of containing odors. You can imagine if it's a wastewater treatment facility, there's some, unpleasant smells that are associated with all that material. So having an in-vessel system meets their needs. As that facility is very close to the slaughter pen trail system and a number of residential properties. Uh, Another example of a compost pile that I've come across is here in the top middle. This is actually from a community garden that somebody showed me. They said, "Oh, do you want to see our compost pile?" And they take me over to a pile of stems and twigs, and that's their organic refuse heap. And I know that Colin Massey talked about how over time, the materials will compost, they will biodegrade and, reduce to their constituent parts. But this isn't really an active compost pile in the way that we typically think of it. Um, As you saw a few times, I think Fabian had this slide. These are windrows. So this would be, I think these are 150 foot, 100-foot windrows that the city of Fort Smith puts together. Basically, they incorporate all of their yard waste. They chip it, they fragment it, make sure it's small particle size, and then they turn it as needed to make sure they get the incorporation of their green matter and brown matter, and they get that active composting. So bear in mind when we're describing how to use compost, we need to be very thoughtful about where we're getting it. Is it a compost, source from my backyard where it's like, I don't know how thoroughly it got heated. I don't know if I really got weed seed kill, if I got, pathogen kill as thoroughly as some of these other processes. Or is it something more like a commercial or municipal system where, they have mandated record keeping to demonstrate they got to temperature and had the thorough composting process that occurred. So as far as today, we're going to ask, why do we amend our soils? What's the importance of soil testing? Characteristics of compost. Testing compost specifically for fertility uses, and then some resources that y'all can use. So just as a reminder, we always need to be testing our soils. Before you start thinking about what you're going to do to amend your soils, you need to know what's going on. So you have to know what you've got, what nutrients do you have in your system, what nutrients do you need, and then you may recall, where's your pH. So the pH is really a good determinant of whether or not the materials that are present in your soil are going to be available to the plant. If your soils are too acidic, oftentimes we'll have restrictions on certain nutrient availability. And similarly, if they get too alkaline, if the pH gets too high, we often are looking for slightly acidic soils or even neutral soils, but slightly acidic is really the sweet spot for plant nutrient availability. So just keep that in mind, because if you get the soil test from the state, it might say that your potassium is in good shape, your other nutrients are in good shape. But if your pH is out of balance, we're going to need to address that as the very start. As a reminder, you can get your soils tested for free from your local by submitting a soil sample to your local cooperative extension service office. So look up what county you're in and who you need to contact. But that is something that's freely available for nutrient testing, pH testing, and things of that nature. So as far as why we would use soil amendments, well, the immediate needs are we were going to need to add nutrients for fertility needs. We want to build up soil structure. So soil structure is, how well the soil aggregates and clumps up. Colin spoke about how you can't change the soil texture with our heavy clays, but if we can add organic matter, sometimes we can help that clay kind of form aggregates such that we might get some more infiltration into a really heavy waterlogged clay soil. So soil structure is always something that can help certain types of soils. We might want to adjust our pH, and then we also might have a surface mulch that we're interested in. As far as the long term, we might be interested in increasing soil health. That's just the long-term performance of our soils. You might just be interested in sequestering carbon. There's actually offset credits that could happen on certain types of operations. And then ideally, you can reduce your inputs. If you have higher performing soils, better water retention, better drainage, that could save you a lot of other issues. You won't need to worry about digging, drainage channels. You won't need to irrigate as often. So you can have long-term benefits by amending your soils over time. So the properly amended soils, they're going to have all the plant nutrients available to the plants and appropriate drainage, water retention, all those things for our desired crops. So we'll have gotten our soils tested. We know whether or not we have the calcium, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, all these things in the soil. And then we know whether we need to add anything as well. So if you want to grow the best crops, you have to manage your soils properly. So again, get our soil test, look at where you're deficient, look at where you're excessive, and make sure we're adding the right amendments. And this can be really tricky with compost because of how it's not usually a single nutrient material, right? So let's take a look with our synthetic fertilizers. We have urea, ammonium nitrate, normal superphosphate, triple superphosphate, potassium nitrate, potassium sulfate, all these different things. And in each column, we have the nitrogen, the phosphorus in the form of P2O5, or the potassium in the form of K2O. So for urea, we have, I apologize, I'll go back for a second. If you've ever seen those three numbers on a fertilizer bag, that's the NPK, the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium in that fertilizer. So for urea, we have 46% urea, or excuse me, nitrogen, 0% phosphorus, 0% potassium. And then we have other materials that are single mineral fertilizers. Ammonium nitrate, 34% nitrogen with nothing else in it. If we look at triple superphosphate, it would be a 0, 46, 0. So no nitrogen, no potassium, no other minerals, just 46% phosphorus as a soil, amending fertilizer. These are really, really valuable fertilizers when we're trying to just, dial things in perfectly. Of course, these are synthetic fertilizers, so they're in conventional systems. If we were to switch and look at the natural or organic fertilizers, the numbers are going to come down quite a bit. We don't have nearly as many double-digit values, and they tend to just be lower when they are double digits, 10 or 15%. And so let's take a look at an example of one of our higher nitrogen values, guano. So bat droppings, 10% nitrogen, 2% phosphorus, 1.7% potassium. And so we're going to need a lot more guano by volume, or excuse me, by mass, than we would need urea to get the equivalent nitrogen credits. And so then let's see if we jump all the way down to compost. This is a generalization, but our compost really only has about 2% at most nitrogen concentration with some phosphorus, with some potassium, and then many, many other minerals that might also show up. So it's a low density nutrient amendment. It does not have very high nutrients per mass. It does have a lot of organic matter, but it doesn't have tons and tons of nutrients like some of these other materials. And as a reminder, not all compost is the same. So we talked about where it came from, but it also just what's the feedstock, how it's managed, when we collect it. So as we mentioned about the importance of soil testing, I'm going to circle back and communicate the importance of testing the compost we get. So this is my grad student Rachel here pictured. The reason the state perceives compost as a waste product. The Arkansas Division of Environmental Quality will require testing to make sure that compost does not harm the environment. It makes sure that it doesn't have harmful trace elements like chromium and arsenic and all these different trace metals. And that's very important because they can't release this material to the public that then is going to cause an environmental hazard. They also test for coliform bacteria and salmonella to make sure that it doesn't cause a public health hazard. So they're making sure they're not harming humans. They're making sure they're not harming the environment. And then as far as the state's regulation is concerned, that's enough. There's no other information. So the required testing is based on temperature. They have to make sure that they get to a certain temperature for a period of time. They test to make sure there's not these harmful bacteria, and they test for these, trace metals. They also test for pH, I will admit that. So they tell us that we have no pathogens, no pollutants, and then they turn it over to the public. So does that mean with that information, are we ready to amend our soils with that material, right? Do we know anything about the material? We don't know the calcium concentration. We don't know the nitrogen. We don't know the phosphorus. We don't know the potassium. We don't know all of that. And so without that information, we're really operating blind. We only know that we're not going to harm ourselves or the environment. Well, that doesn't tell us very much. So instead, we think we need to characterize that. And this is something that Rachel's going to be working on and has been working on very hard for the past, 18 months now? Year and a half? Yeah. So we've got 51 permitted compost facilities in the state. Wow, that's so many compost facilities. I had no idea. Well, in fact, there's 9 that we've contacted that are willing to turn over their materials. I think we have 11 sources of compost because some of them have multiple types of compost. I see you
We're
unmuted.
we're now at 14.
Hey, 14. So that's
Yeah.
that's I mean that's quite a lot, honestly. It's more than I realized. But um these are permitted facilities, and the issue is ADEQ issues the permits to anyone who requests them, and it's really easy to retain a permit, but they weren't actually operational. So all these dots, only a small fraction of them are actually operational. Um, but what we've been interested in is going and testing for all these things. How can we characterize the compost from the city of Fayetteville, that's from food waste. What about the city of Fayetteville? That's from yard waste. What about Fort Smith, which uses yard waste compost? And Bentonville, which uses materials derived from biosolids and from yard waste. And so we have all these different moving parts that are going into the compost, how it's managed, how long they retain it before they turn it over to the public. And the only information that the state insists they provide is that it isn't harmful. So Rachel's worked very, very hard to collect samples from all these facilities. There's a lot of miles on the road to go collect them directly from the site. And then we're going to test them, and we have been testing them for all of these characteristics: bulk density, pH, the macro and micronutrients, the total nitrogen, as well as the forms of that nitrogen, the total carbon, the carbon to nitrogen ratio, and then the electrical conductivity. Um, so we ask ourselves, will those values vary based on what's going into the feedstock? What is making the compost? So will it change if we're working with food waste compost? Will it change if we're just using yard waste or biosolids or combinations? The age or maturity of the compost, and then how it's managed. So this is something that we're really trying to develop guidelines. We're never going to be able to predict and model every single compost pile. We're not going to be able to say yard waste, Fort Smith, that's going to be 1.3% nitrogen. But we could develop ranges. If we've characterized every single, permitted compost facility in the state, we can tell growers, you're never going to see something more than 2.5%. The highest that we ever observed was 2.1% on an as-is basis, or, things of that nature. So if we can develop ranges, then we've got guidelines for recommendations of how to use this and what to really expect. Because if you think you're going to get all your nitrogen credits from your compost, you're going to end up with yellow plants. There's other things that you need to put into the soil to give them and meet their nitrogen needs. On the flip side, if you tried to use all the compost, you'd be neck deep in compost. It just takes too much. Um, One thing to be aware of, I mentioned the maturity of the compost. This is a whole sheet of how it works, but I'll talk about this on Friday. But there's a period of time that they should hold the compost, that there's kind of like a breakdown that needs to occur. And oftentimes the facilities will give it away before it's gotten to that mature stage. So that's just something to be aware of. You should be looking at is this still a biologically active material, or is it a stable material? And so I'm not going to go through the whole figure, but that was the reason that was included. Um, we do know that compost is a slow release fertilizer. So when you put that material out, it does not immediately become plant available. The nitrogen that is in the material is in an organic form. It will need to mineralize and release from its, tied up versions for it to be plant accessible. I'm not the right person to talk about the nitrogen cycle, but that is something that needs to occur. Whereas synthetic fertilizers, they're generally immediately available. You get a very quick plant response. So the good news is for compost, you can amend it on your beds prior to planting, prior to things occurring, and you're not really at risk of that nitrogen leaching into the local water systems unless it were to physically move, the compost material physically like eroded away. But you don't get that immediate, green up response that you would get with something like Miracle Grow or True Green or things like that. So you have to be aware that compost and the other organic soil amendments like chicken feather meal, blood meal, they take some time to degrade and mineralize to be available in the plant available form. So with the municipal compost that we've got, this is a dated slide at this point. I apologize that I've got 2022 results there. Just check the source that you've got, whether it's yard waste, whether it's food waste. I have noticed, talking to some farmers, they often are trying to use yard waste first if they're certified organic, because there are materials that get into the food waste stream that some of the organic certifiers have given them trouble about. Like, so if some of these, I know we've talked about BPI certified compostable materials. For whatever reason, the certifiers that work with certain organic farms in Arkansas have said that you need to demonstrate hardship if you're using food waste compost. You have to demonstrate that you were not able to get yard waste compost before you can use food waste compost as one of your organic amendments. So just be aware of that as one little hang up. I would have no reservations, but I don't run a certified organic farm, right? So you have to make sure you're compliant with your certifier. So that's one thing to be aware of. And the same would be true for biosolids. But do look for tests. We are very fortunate. The city of Fayetteville will annually get their materials sent off to Midwest laboratories and have them tested for all these, nutrients. City of Little Rock and other groups also, I've seen them post it, but everybody's municipal website changes when new people get hired and different things get updated at different rates. So I'm not going to speak to that being immediately available. Now, I mentioned that we have very low nutrient requirements, or excuse me, very low nutrient concentrations in the minerals or in the composts. So a lot of compost would be needed, or you'd need to be ready to give nitrogen from other sources. And I don't think there's any problem if you're somebody who is a conventional gardener who uses different inputs. Don't think compost won't work for you. It still will work. You can throw Miracle Grow right on top of compost, and it performs and functions and does all the soil health benefits in addition to the synthetic materials, right? So don't steer clear of it just because you're not organic, just because you're not, that type of producer. You should be using it where you can, but be aware. Here we were getting 1.5% as is from food waste, or 1.1% nitrogen from yard waste compost. So generally, we have seen that the food waste compost has higher nitrogen concentration, but the yard waste is a little bit lower. So just be aware of that. Just be aware, I mentioned with the maturity slide, compost is ready to apply without further aging. So I've seen this. I don't want to name names of a facility, but we were there. I think it was March, and a bucket loader dug into the compost pile and dumped it into someone's truck, and steam was just billowing out of this compost pile. We stuck our thermometer in. It was at like 155. It was like really, really hot, and not just when people use the term hot, they often mean that it's contaminated with something else. Oh, but like this is hot, like it's exothermic, like physically generating heat. So that means it's still very biologically active. And the problem with that is, so what do you think happens if you throw compost that's got tons of feeding microbes into your soils, and then you start adding your other amendments? Well, the microbes eat them up. The microbes will use the nitrogen that you intended for your plants, and they will instead use that to make more microbes. And the problem is then when you think you're getting nitrogen as a fertilizer, you're actually using nitrogen as a food for those bacteria and for those microbes. So you can hold immature compost, but if it's still actively exothermic and generating heat, it can cause problems, and it can starve plants of nutrients. So the key takeaways: test your soils. That's free. You can do that at your local extension office. Test your compost. That's not free. And you need to work with your county agent on how to submit that, because all of the soil tests go to Mariana, the centralized soil test lab, but the composts are going to be tested at the the Fayetteville Agricultural Diagnostic Laboratory. It's not super expensive. It's like $15. Be ready to supplement your compost with other fertilizers. You're not going to get the nitrogen credits you need from compost alone. Even if you're using cover crops, even if you're using other things, just be aware that there's going to be a nitrogen credit that you're deficient in. You're going to need a little bit more throughout the cycle. So look out for that. Be careful of immature compost because you don't want the microbes eating up the other nutrients that you intended for your plants. And the last thing would be conduct bioassays if you're unsure. So basically, Rachel will talk about what a bioassay is and how you do it. But you might just, before you throw it across your favorite garden site, why don't you take a look at it in your greenhouse and see how it performs and make sure there aren't problems. I'll leave it to Rachel to talk about how those are done, but bioassays are a really good way to investigate the material before you apply it to your favorite gardening site. So additional resources, I will link. I'll provide it in the recordings description. But you can find some ways on how to soil test. There's different print media publications for how to compost, understanding the soil testing. And with that, I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Perfect. All right. Thank you for the introduction, Dr. Fertucci. I am Rachel Woody-Pumford. I am one of his PhD students, and I'm going to be talking about preventing disaster, how to test your compost for herbicide contamination. One thing you need to know is that most herbicides aren't going to make it through to your compost. There are just a few that have specific warning labels that you need to be aware of. So it's always important that you read a herbicide label before using that material in a compost pile. So there's certain herbicides that can be digested by cattle, so you can spray it on a pasture, cattle can eat it, and then their manure is now contaminated. That manure, if you use that in the compost, or if you use that hay that was sprayed as like a mulch or in a compost, that's what's going to pass through. So it's always important that you read the labels, and some of them even just have a picture that show you to not put it in the compost. These are the specific herbicides of concerns. They're all pyridine carboxylic acids. There's also a pyrimidine carboxylic acid that's not on this list, which is aminocyclopyrrochlor. These herbicides are persistent through the composting process. So they have long half-lives, which means that they can survive that composting, and then if you land apply it, they can last in your soil for months to even years. So you need to be able to keep an eye out and be aware of these potential concerns. And usually how they end up in fields, and unfortunately this happened just recently, I believe Dr. Fertucci mentioned it on Monday. We had a grower in Crawford County, we heard from their extension agent that they had manure, it's great, they went ahead and spread it over their garden and wiped out their whole garden because they had used Grazon. And I'm not sure which Grazon they used, so unfortunately there's two different Grazons that have herbicides of risk. The Grazon Next HL has aminopyrrolid, and there's Grazon P plus D, which has picloram. And both of these are the herbicides of concern. So we've tested 4 different herbicides in our lab in bioassays. Aminocyclopyrrochlor, also known as method 240SL, is labeled for the control of broadleaf weeds and brush in non-crop areas. So along highway rights of way, you can also do it in usually that's where they're going to see this. Utility rights of ways, they use it around airports, things like that. And it has at the very top of its label, it says to not use on plant material treated for compost or mulch. We've also tested aminopyrrolid, which you might know as Milestone. It's for controlling annual and perennial broadleaf weeds in turf pasture systems, as well as woody plants and vines. And you can use these in rangelands, you can use it in conservation reserve program lands. So it has a lot of use, mostly in grasses. We've also tested clopyrrolid, also referred to as Stinger, and it has a warning, but it's pretty buried. You'd have to read this label pretty closely, which is a concern that it's, I think, on page 4 or 5. So you have to read pretty deep. And what we use Stinger for is primarily for post-emergent weed control of broadleaf weeds and a wide variety of crops, including apples, barley, oat, wheat. You can also use it for Christmas tree plantations, corn. It's got a wide range of uses. And finally, we tested picloram, also referred to as Triumph 22K or Tordon 22K. It's for annual and perennial broadleaf weeds as well, and you can use it for woody plants and vines in rangelands and other pasture systems. And again, it also has a pretty buried label that says that you can't use the manure or any of the treated vegetation in your composting pile. So how do you test if you have herbicide contamination in your compost? You can either submit a sample to a testing lab, but it can get pretty costly pretty quick. because you have to pay per sample. So for example, if you got Fayetteville's food waste, compost, and their yard waste, you'd want to submit 2 samples. But you also have to pay for every herbicide you want to test for. So if you want to test for all 4 herbicides, you're not paying for those 4 times the 2, so suddenly you're paying for 8 tests. And the conservative threshold for all these herbicides is about 50 parts per billion. And a concern we have is that some plants might be more sensitive than these testing thresholds. So you might get back that it's clean, they didn't detect any herbicide, but then you go and you spread the compost and you might still have issues. So we are working on developing a bioassay protocol so you can test the seeds or seedlings that you're already going to be using in your garden or fields and see whether there are harmful effects to your most sensitive crop species before spreading it across the site. What you'll need for this is you'll need compost of your choice. The pictured compost is from Hot Springs. They also do a biosolid yard waste compost, but you can also use Fayetteville's, Bentonville's, you can use Fort Smith's, you can get compost shipped to you from an outside provider, whatever compost you plan on spreading. And then you'll want perlite and sphagnum peat moss. These are the ones we use. They have just a tiny bit of fertilizer in them. So it might not be considered organic. You'd have to double check with those because I believe they use synthetic fertilizers. And then seeds. For this, we're working on making vegetable protocols for whatever you might be growing, but the current standard crops are garden pea, red clover, or bush bean. But again, use whatever you have on hand because those are the plants you are most concerned with. Then finally, you'll need containers for measuring, mixing, and then sowing the seeds into. For the bioassay, you're going to use the perlite and sphagnum moss. You're going to mix them together in equal parts by volume. So if you have 8 quarts of perlite, mix it with 8 quarts of sphagnum moss, perfect. Or if you plan on only doing a little bit at a time, you can just mix in a cup of each or, a gallon of each, whatever suits your needs. You're also going to decide what size containers you want to use for the test, because what you'll need is a container large enough for the seedling for 4 weeks, because you want to be able to grow it and to make sure you can see any injury symptoms that might develop. There are some bioassay protocols that recommend 2 weeks, but we've seen that injury symptoms sometimes develop at 3 or 4 weeks. So it's better to err on a side of more caution. So if you have a 72 cell tray and you're worried your plants won't make it that long in for a 4-week period, that wouldn't be the ideal size to use. We use 4-inch geranium pots because we found that worked a little better. We tried also with 3-inch pots, but the plants were getting a little too large by the end of our trial. For the mix, you'll be mixing 1 volume part compost to 3 parts perlite and sphagnum moss. For our 4 containers, we ultimately needed a gallon, so we would do 1 pint of the compost to 1.5 quarts, I have pints listed for both, to 3 pints of the perlite and sphagnum moss mixed. So that way you'll ultimately have you can also look at it, it's got 2 cups and 6 cups. It's a 1-to-3 ratio that you're going to be mixing together. You don't want to look at this by weight because you'll have variable weights. So you can see this 1 pint of compost, it is 224.9 grams, whereas 3 times as much perlite and sphagnum moss weighs 424. So it's better to do based on that volume ratio. Also, based on how dry your perlite and sphagnum moss are, they might be substantially lighter as well. The next step is to mix that compost with perlite and sphagnum moss thoroughly. You want to make sure it's thoroughly incorporated, and you'll want to add water to the point where it's moist to the touch but not wet. So typically what you'd want for seed sowing. You want to be able to squeeze it and not have water drip out, but it's able to hold its shape to some degree. And then you'll put these in your pots and sow seeds to the appropriate depth per species. Typically, I recommend for whatever seed size you have, that's about how deep you want to go into the soil. And also to make sure you've got enough that'll germinate well, we usually do 2 or 3 seeds per pot just to ensure, and then you'll thin as you go to leave 1 plant per pot. So this is a picture from our most recent bioassay trial, and you can see there's still 2 in that first pot, whereas the rest have 1. I went and pinched off the other seedling, so that way we had enough room in each pot. For these, you'll want to water the seeds in well, and they'll place the pots and the seeds in a nice, warm, well-lit space, and water is needed over the next few weeks. We recommend using a tray to catch any water that runs off. So if there is herbicide in there, it won't just leach out and not show any symptoms. You'd rather contain that potential herbicide to show any symptoms that might be there. There are other recommendations to bottom water, which we tested as well, and we could see that there is a lot of root growth underneath the pot, which caused us issues down the road. So we found it was easier just to water sparingly multiple times more regularly. If also possible, it's helpful to sow 2 or 3 seeds in just perlite and sphagnum moss in the same size container. So that way you can see the growth comparisons to have a clean control to compare against. You might have that 72 cell tray with all of your tomatoes, but they'll typically stay smaller in that smaller cell versus in the bigger pot. So it's helpful to see about approximately how big they should be and what they would look like at that size. For
If you don't mind, I was going to mention we did have a question that I want to make sure we have time to get to just because somebody asked it.
Yeah.
I thought this was a natural spot, so thank you for sharing that. Somebody asked, my compost typically cooks in my big 8-foot diameter barrel about 3 weeks until it's black and no longer hot, then goes onto a pile on the ground to mature. Do I need to turn the pile any more at that point? I would think that sounds good. That's a huge 8-foot diameter. That's a big barrel. I would think that that sounds good. I mean, the only concern I would have is if it's getting uniformly to temperature in that large of a volume, if it's turned like if that's a rotating drum or not. But it sounds to me like if it's been out in a pile on the ground to mature, it's ready to land apply. I would think, with the only exception of what are you putting into it? You know, are there any potential, contaminants that could, I don't know if we mentioned don't put dog waste and things like that in there. Like, but I've got chickens and I put my chicken manure in there. And so now I'm very careful about where I apply my compost. So just be aware of what you're putting in there if you're concerned about that going into like a vegetable garden space. But if it's a landscape or if it's under tree, like it would be ready. I would say yes. I think at that point it's ready. The only concern I have is the assurance that that got uniformly hot. But otherwise, yeah, it seems mature and ready to go.
Yeah, I'd agree. One concern you might also have is how long it's sitting. There might be possibilities of weed seed capture. If it sits too long unstirred, you might get weed seeds on the top, whereas if it's still hot in the pile, you can incorporate it in and then potentially kill some more weed seeds.
Okay, thank you.
So for assessing plant injury, it's rated on a 0 to 5 scale. 0 would be that there's no visible symptoms and plant growth and leaf development look completely normal. You wouldn't be able to identify this plant versus another plant that had no compost added. A 1 would be slight injury, so you might see some upward cupping, and I'm going to have pictures of all these. You don't have to imagine, no worries. And then slight to moderate, you'd see the newest leaves might be severely cupped and just some general leaf cupping on some of the other leaves. Moderate are some leaves are severely cupped, and there's leaf cupping on most leaves. Moderate to severe, the majority of the leaves are severely cupped. And for the 5 severe, you'll see the apical meristem or the growing point will have some abnormal growth, so it'll look deformed. The injury thresholds, 0, it's safe to apply this compost, it's ready to go. If you get a 1 or a 2, it's better to retest. So you'll want to test that compost again and make sure that there is now either no injury or it's still a low level injury. If it's anything greater than a 2, that means the damage exceeds the recovery threshold. So you do not want to spread this compost. You either want to wait and test it again in 6 months to a year. And if it's better then you can apply, or just don't apply it at all. And then if there's other abnormalities, so different than the leaf cupping or deformed growth, that might be other issues such as nutrition, or there's a wide variety. It could be other sort of contaminants in there that are causing issues. So it requires further investigation, and that's when you'd want to submit that sample for additional testing. This is what a totally normal pumpkin plant looks like. It has no injury. It's grown out to 4 weeks. There's some slight chlorosis on there. They were just getting tired of being in these 4-inch pots and wanted to be in the ground weeks ago, but otherwise they look totally fine. This is slight injury. You can see that there is both upward and downward cupping on the edges of the leaves. So they're slightly upturned, but most of the leaves look fine. If this would be considered slight, you might still go ahead and retest it though, just to be sure before you spread it and potentially cause issues. This is slight to moderate. You can see more of the leaves are cupped. You can see that the newer leaves are all cupped. despite not having injury prior, but they are beginning to curl more into each other, and the leaves are just generally more crinkled. This is moderate injury. Now, a majority of the leaves are either upward or downward curls. You can also see that the plants are starting to curve in a way where they're not as straight and upright as the non-treated control was. This is moderate to severe. You can see a lot more severe cupping. You can see that these leaves are deformed, the veins are curling into each other. It almost looks like a drawstring pulled the bottom of the leaf together, and there's just more clubbing that you see as well. And then finally, the severe, you can see in the top two pictures how it's fully deformed at the top of the plant. You can also see there's abnormal growths at the epicotyl, so right above the cotyledons, there's these growths where it's trying to put out new roots because it's having issues getting nutrients up to the top of the plant, and also has malformed brace roots at the bottom because, again, it just can't get the nutrients it needs, so it's trying to send out emergency signals to get help. So I mentioned earlier, we recommend you wait 4 weeks before spreading the compost. These are plants that were all treated with aminocyclopyrrochlor. The week 1 of treatment, the cotyledons, they all look the same. You can't tell what is the non-treated versus the 400 parts per billion plants. So these are all low level. They all look the same. At week 2, that highest level herbicide injury is noticeable. So that one you'd be like, oh, something's wrong. But the rest of them all look pretty okay. With 3 weeks, you can notice that the 50 looks a little bit questionable. 100, 200, and 400 all look bad. You wouldn't want to apply. And at 4 weeks after treatment, you can see that even the 25 is starting to have cupping. So you'd want to test at least the 25 and 50 again, and you would not have spread the upper 3 injury symptoms levels. So again, this is what week 2 versus week 4 is. So if you called it at week 2 and said, oh, everything is fine, I'm ready to apply this compost to all but maybe this one sample of compost that looks a little injured, you could potentially have issue to your more sensitive plants down the road. So remember, when in doubt, don't spread the compost. It's always easier to retest. You'd rather waste another month before spreading the compost than spreading the compost and dealing with issues for the next potentially year or more. So remember, do a bioassay instead. Submit. If you have any questions, you're always welcome to reach out to us about how to do it. We're happy to share pictures and protocols. We just want to make it accessible to you. Thank you so much, everybody.